The train rattled along the tracks. It was the same monotonous journey David took every day. He would glance at his reflection in the window. He saw a man with tired eyes staring back. He was lost in thought. His life was a series of routines. He longed for something more, anything more. The train screeched to a halt. It was his stop. David disembarked, joining the throng of people. Their faces were grim. They were all heading towards the same fate, another day at the office, like cogs in a machine they were. He walked with the crowd towards the towering skyscrapers. They were symbols of power and ambition. He felt insignificant beneath their imposing presence. Stepping into the office building, he felt a shiver. It was a cold, sterile environment. It sucked the life out of him. As he sat down at his desk, a wave of emptiness washed over him. This was his life. Was this all there was? He stared at the computer screen. He felt a knot of dread forming in his stomach. Something didn't feel right. The words echoed in David's ears. Downsizing, restructuring, let go, they were corporate euphemisms. He knew what they meant. His heart pounded in his chest. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. His job was gone. He stared blankly at his computer screen. The words swam before his eyes. He felt a surge of anger, then despair. What was he going to do? How would he pay his bills? He felt lost and alone. He mechanically packed his belongings. A cardboard box, his only possession now. His colleagues avoided his gaze. They knew his fate. They pitied him. He felt like a failure. He walked out of the office building. The weight of the world was on his shoulders. The city lights seemed to mock him. The once familiar streets now felt alien. He was adrift. Back at his apartment, David stared at his phone. He had a voicemail. He pressed play. It was his Aunt Clara's voice. Her voice was frail. She spoke of an inheritance. Aunt Clara was a recluse. He barely knew her. She lived in some remote town he had never even visited. Her inheritance was a mystery. He had always assumed she had nothing. The voicemail mentioned a mansion. It was his now. He was the sole beneficiary. He listened to the message again. His aunt's voice was filled with urgency. He had to come immediately. He hesitated. This was all too strange, too sudden. But what choice did he have? He was unemployed, alone. This could be a new start. He had to see it. The drive was long and arduous. The highway stretched before him. It was an endless ribbon of asphalt. The landscape was desolate. It mirrored his mood. He drove for hours. The sun began to set. It cast long shadows across the road. He felt a growing sense of unease. He was entering the unknown. He checked the GPS. He was still miles away. He was tired, hungry. He wished he'd stayed in the city. What was he doing? He pressed on. The road became narrower. It was poorly lit. He felt a chill. The car's headlights illuminated a sign. Welcome to Silent Hollow, population 113. He was almost there. Section 4, The Arrival. The town was shrouded in darkness. The streetlights flickered. It was like something out of a horror movie. He felt a shiver run down his spine. He drove slowly. The GPS led him to a dirt road. It was overgrown with weeds. He parked the car. He could go no further. He stepped out. The air was heavy and still. He felt a presence. He could see it in the distance. The mansion, it stood on a hill. It was a Gothic monstrosity. It was even more imposing in the darkness. He took a deep breath. He started walking. The silence was deafening. He could hear his own heart beating. He felt a sense of dread. He was being watched. But by whom? He quickened his pace. He needed to get inside. Section 5, The Mansion. He stood before the mansion. It towered over him. It was like something out of a nightmare. The windows were dark, empty. Or were they? He felt a chill. He reached for the doorknob. It was cold, metallic. He hesitated. What was he getting himself into? But it was too late to turn back now. He turned the knob. The door creaked open. It revealed a darkened hallway. The air inside was stale, musty. He stepped inside. He felt a presence. He called out, "Hello?" "Is anyone here?" His voice echoed. Silence. He was alone. Or was he? He took a step forward. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He was home! Section 1. Whispers in the Dark. Dust motes danced in the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. The mansion was eerily silent, save for the sound of David's own breathing. He felt a growing sense of unease. This place had a strange energy, a palpable darkness. He wandered through the darkened hallways, his hand trailing along the cold, damp walls. Cobwebs clung to his fingers like ghostly fingers. He shivered. He had to find a light switch. He needed to see. As he rounded a corner, he thought he heard something, a whisper, faint but distinct. It seemed to come from the very walls themselves. He stopped, holding his breath, listening intently. The sound came again, a low, guttural murmur. It was closer this time. He couldn't make out any words, just a feeling, a sense of dread that seemed to seep into his bones. He quickened his pace, eager to escape the suffocating darkness. Section 2. The Portrait Gallery. He stumbled upon a grand staircase. The steps were covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for what seemed like centuries. He hesitated, then slowly began to ascend, each creak of the wooden steps echoing through the vast emptiness. He reached the top of the stairs and found himself in a long gallery. The walls were lined with portraits, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. They were all dressed in the finery of a bygone era. Their faces were grim, haunting. One portrait in particular caught his eye. It was a woman in a long, flowing white gown. Her eyes were piercing blue, filled with a strange intensity. He felt drawn to her, compelled to know her story. As he stepped closer, he felt a cold draft. The air grew heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The woman in the portrait seemed to stare right through him, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, judged. Section 3. A Glimmer in the Mirror. He tore his gaze from the unsettling portrait and hurried down the gallery. He needed to find a room, any room, to escape the oppressive atmosphere. He pushed open a door and entered a dusty old bedroom. The air in the room was thick with the smell of decay and neglect. A four-poster bed dominated the center of the room, its heavy velvet curtains ripped and faded. A dressing table stood against one wall, its silver-backed mirror tarnished with age. He approached the mirror, drawn by a strange compulsion. As he peered into its depths, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the reflection. A fleeting glimpse of something dark and shapeless lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. He spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Had he imagined it? Or was there something else here with him? Something unseen that moved through the shadows of this ancient house. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. Section 4. The Forbidden Library. Determined to find some answers, David began exploring the mansion more systematically. He found himself drawn to a particular wing, its door locked and barred. Curiosity and a growing sense of urgency compelled him to force the door open. He stepped inside and gasped. It was a library, its shelves stacked floor to ceiling with ancient tomes bound in leather and iron. The air was thick with the smell of aging paper and dust. A single window cast a shaft of light into the gloom, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk, its surface covered in scattered papers and open books. A nameplate on the desk read, Elias Ravenwood. He had found his aunt's ancestors' study. A sense of foreboding washed over him. He had stumbled upon something forbidden. He reached out and gently touched one of the books, its leather cover cold and dry beneath his fingertips. As he did so, he felt a jolt like a static shock run up his arm. He pulled back his hand, startled. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an oppressive weight. Section 5. The Diary of Elias Ravenwood. Ignoring the growing unease, David began to examine the contents of the desk. He found journals, maps, and strange artifacts he couldn't identify. And then he saw it. A leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. He opened it, his heart pounding. The diary belonged to Elias Ravenwood himself. In elegant, flowing script, he wrote of his fascination with the occult, of dark rituals and forbidden knowledge. The entries grew more disturbing as David read on. Elias wrote of summoning entities, of making deals with forces beyond human comprehension. David's blood ran cold as he read of a ritual gone wrong, of a presence unleashed upon the house, a malevolent entity that craved darkness and despair. He realized with growing horror that he was not alone in this house. He was in danger. Suddenly, he heard a noise from the hallway, a soft, shuffling sound like footsteps approaching. He slammed the diary shut, his heart pounding in his chest. He was trapped in the library with something sinister. He had to escape. Section 6. The Shadowy Figure. David slowly backed away from the desk, his eyes fixed on the library door. The shuffling sound grew louder. He could hear the rasp of breath, the creak of floorboards under unseen weight. Fear propelled him towards a bookshelf, seeking a hiding place. As he squeezed behind a towering stack of books, the library door creaked open. The sound sent shivers down his spine. He held his breath, peering through the narrow gap between the books. A shadowy figure entered the room, its form indistinct in the gloom. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. It seemed to glide through the air, its form shifting and wavering in the flickering candlelight. David felt a cold dread grip his heart. He couldn't make out any features, just a sense of overwhelming malice emanating from the figure. The shadowy figure paused in the center of the room, its head tilting to one side as if listening for something. David shrank back further into the shadows, praying that he wouldn't be discovered. He didn't dare to breathe, terrified that even the slightest sound would betray his presence. Section 7. The Screaming Portrait. The shadowy figure remained motionless for what seemed like an eternity. Then, it slowly turned its head towards the bookshelf where David was hiding. He felt a surge of pure terror. He was going to be discovered, but instead of moving towards him, the figure turned and glided silently across the room to the far wall. It stopped in front of the portrait of the woman in white. David watched in horrified fascination as the figure reached out a shadowy hand and touched the painting. As soon as the figure touched the canvas, the portrait seemed to come alive. The woman's eyes flew open, her mouth contorted into a silent scream of terror. Her painted hand clawed at the frame, as if desperate to escape the confines of the portrait. The shadowy figure turned its head towards David, its unseen eyes boring into his soul. And then, with a chilling shriek that echoed through the mansion, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of decay and the echo of the woman's silent scream. David didn't hesitate. He scrambled out from his hiding place, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The library, once a place of solace, was now a hunting ground. The shadowy figure was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating. He had to get out of the mansion, escape the clutches of whatever evil had been unleashed within its walls. He burst out of the library, his footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. The mansion seemed to press in around him, the air growing thick and oppressive. He could hear the shadowy figure moving behind him, its presence more felt than seen. A cold wind followed him, whispering his name, urging him forward. He didn't dare look back, his mind conjuring images of the figure's shifting form, its unseen eyes burning into his back. He careened through the mansion, his mind a blur of fear and adrenaline. Each room seemed to blend into the next, a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. He stumbled over unseen obstacles, his breath catching in his throat. He had to find a way out, had to escape the clutches of this nightmare. He burst through a set of double doors, finding himself in a grand ballroom. The room was dimly lit by a dying fire in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dull and lifeless. The room was eerily silent, the air thick with the weight of forgotten memories. He could almost hear the faint strains of music, the echo of laughter and conversation long past. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He knew he couldn't stay there. The shadowy figure would find him, he was sure of it. But where could he go? The mansion seemed to stretch on forever, a maze of corridors and hidden rooms. He was trapped, hunted. He noticed a faint light emanating from beneath a heavy oak door at the far end of the ballroom. Hope surged through him. Perhaps it was a way out, a chance to escape this nightmare. He moved towards the door, his footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor. He pushed open the door, his hand trembling slightly. The light led him up a narrow, winding staircase. The air grew colder as he climbed, the scent of damp stone and dust filling his nostrils. He emerged into a small, circular room. The room was dominated by a massive clock mechanism, its gears and cogs whirring and clicking in a hypnotic rhythm. A single window offered a panoramic view of the grounds below, the moon casting an eerie glow on the twisted trees in the distance. He had stumbled upon the mansion's clock tower. He could see the faint outline of the town in the distance, its lights twinkling like fireflies in the night. A glimmer of hope flickered within him. He could escape, make his way to the town, seek help. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something strange. A figure was standing in the shadows, its form barely discernible against the dark stone wall. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't alone. The figure stepped forward into the moonlight, and David gasped. It was the woman from the portrait, the one in the flowing white gown. Her eyes, once filled with a haunting intensity in the painting, now held a look of sadness and resignation. She spoke, her voice a soft whisper that seemed to echo in the confines of the clock tower. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her gaze fixed on David. "This place is dangerous. You need to leave." David stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Was she real? A ghost? A figment of his imagination? He didn't know what to believe anymore. The lines between reality and nightmare had become blurred. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this place?" He needed answers, needed to understand the darkness that seemed to be closing in around him. The woman sighed, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "My name is Eleanor," she said, her voice filled with sorrow, "and this was once my home." She told him her story, a tragic tale of love, betrayal, and a darkness unleashed. She had been in love with Elias Ravenwood, but their love was forbidden. Her father, a powerful man, had promised her to another. In his grief and despair, Elias had turned to forbidden knowledge, seeking a way to break the curse of their circumstances. He had performed a ritual, a summoning, seeking to bind Eleanor to him forever. But something had gone wrong. The ritual had unleashed a malevolent entity, a being of pure darkness that fed on negative emotions. Elias had tried to sever the connection, to banish the entity back to the abyss, but it was too late. The entity had claimed him, twisted his soul, and trapped him within the mansion's walls for eternity. Eleanor, filled with remorse and a desperate hope to save her beloved, had sought a way to undo the damage. She had discovered an ancient ritual, a way to banish the entity and free Elias from its grasp. "But the ritual requires a sacrifice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A life for a life. It is the only way to restore the balance." David felt a chill run down his spine. He understood. He was the sacrifice. His arrival at the mansion, his connection to Elias through blood, it was all part of the entity's plan. "No," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I won't let you do this." He had to find another way, a way to escape this fate. Section 7. The Choice. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. "You have a choice," she said, her voice echoing in the small space. "You can sacrifice yourself and free Elias, or you can leave this place and condemn him to eternal torment." David felt trapped, caught between a rock and a hard place. He could sacrifice himself, save Elias, and perhaps even find a sort of peace for Eleanor. Or he could choose to save himself, condemning Elias to an eternity of suffering. He looked from Eleanor to the shadowy figure of Elias, who now stood in the doorway, his eyes burning with a mixture of hope and despair. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. And in that moment, David made his choice. Section 1. The Leap of Faith. David looked into Eleanor's eyes, her sorrow a reflection of the mansion's own tormented heart. He couldn't bear the thought of condemning anyone to such a fate, not even a stranger bound to him by a bloodline he barely acknowledged. He drew a shaky breath. The musty air of the clock tower felt heavy, each gulp a monumental effort. "I won't let you suffer anymore," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. He surprised himself with the conviction in his tone. Perhaps losing everything had stripped away more than just his job and apartment. It had peeled back layers of self-preservation, exposing a core of empathy he never knew he possessed. Eleanor's ethereal form wavered, a ripple of what might have been gratitude passing over her features. "You are a good soul," she whispered, her voice laced with a bittersweet melody. "Your sacrifice will not be in vain." She raised her hand, a spectral finger pointing towards the center of the room. An inscription on the floor, nearly invisible under years of grime, became clear. It was the ritual circle, faintly glowing now, pulsing with a power that sent shivers down David's spine. He stepped towards it, each footfall echoing in the silence as if the mansion itself was holding its breath. Section 2. The Confrontation. As David stepped within the circle, he felt a shift in the air. The temperature plummeted, the cold seeping into his bones like icy claws. The clock tower, once a place of potential escape, now felt like a cage, the gears and mechanisms taking on a sinister aspect. The shadowy figure of Elias, no longer content to observe from the periphery, glided towards him. The darkness that clung to him seemed to writhe, eager to consume, to merge, to escape its prison of centuries. Fear, primal and raw, threatened to overwhelm David, yet a strange calm settled within him. This was it. This was his purpose, the reason he was led to this forsaken place. He would face the darkness, not for himself, but for the two souls trapped within its grasp. "I'm ready," David said, his voice surprisingly steady. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the unknown. He felt a surge of energy, a current passing through him, connecting him to the mansion, to Elias, to Eleanor. He was the conduit, the key to their release. The air crackled with power. The clock tower seemed to groan under the strain, the gears grinding against their ancient teeth. David felt himself being pulled in two directions at once, torn between the spectral sorrow of Eleanor and the desperate yearning of Elias. He opened his eyes and cried out, not in pain, but in a surge of empathy so profound it felt like his own soul was splitting apart. He saw the shadowy figure of Elias shudder, the darkness that clung to him receding like a tide pulling back from the shore. Eleanor's spectral form shimmered, becoming more solid, her features losing their ghostly pallor. She reached out, her hand passing through David's chest, not with a touch of coldness, but with a warmth that spread through his body, chasing away the lingering chill. The clock tower was engulfed in a blinding white light. David squeezed his eyes shut against the glare, the air alive with a high-pitched whine, like 1,000 voices singing in unison. The inscription on the floor, the ritual circle, pulsed one last time, then faded, leaving behind only smooth, cold stone. As the light subsided, David slowly opened his eyes. The clock tower was as it had been before, dusty, neglected, the gears and mechanisms ticking away the seconds. Yet something was different. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had clung to the mansion seemed to have lifted. He looked around for Eleanor and Elias, expecting to see them reunited, free from their torment. But the clock tower was empty. He was alone. Had it worked? Had his sacrifice been enough? A wave of exhaustion washed over him, the adrenaline that had fueled him draining away. He stumbled towards the window, leaning against the cool stone, gazing out at the town below. The first rays of dawn were painting the eastern sky with hues of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the darkness he had just faced. A voice, soft and cold, whispered in his ear, "Thank you." David spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. But there was no one there. Only the echo of the voice lingering in the air, filled with a chilling amusement that sent a wave of dread crashing over him. He was not alone. He was never going to be alone again. David stumbled back from the window, his breath catching in his throat. The voice, laced with an insidious sweetness, echoed in his ears. The mansion, once a prison for tormented souls, now held him captive. He fled from the clock tower, his footsteps echoing hollowly. He ran through the silent halls, each creak a mocking echo. He burst out of the mansion doors, the early morning sunlight momentarily blinding. He gasped for air, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He had escaped, but he knew he would never truly be free. David walked away from the mansion, his steps slow and heavy. The town of Silent Hollow lay ahead, its quaint houses and sleepy streets a stark contrast to the horrors he had just endured. He could seek help, tell his story, but who would believe him? Who would understand? He could feel the entity's presence within him, a constant whisper in the back of his mind, a shadow that clung to him, unseen but always felt. It was a part of him now, a chilling reminder of the night he had become both savior and prisoner. He had traded his ordinary life for an extraordinary burden, a destiny intertwined with the supernatural, the line between reality and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. He was no longer just David, the unemployed office worker. He was a vessel, a conduit, his life forever bound to the mansion and the entity it contained. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched toward him like grasping fingers. He walked on, his destination uncertain, his future a terrifying mystery. He was free from the mansion's physical walls, but its darkness had seeped into his soul, a chilling reminder that some choices once made can never be undone. He was left to face his new reality, a reality forever haunted by the lingering presence of Ravenwood Manor.